Welcome to week 24 of Come Follow Me. It should be interesting for you this week. We begin the reign of judges with Alma the Younger as the first chief judge chosen by the voice of the people. We see, and we're going to continue to see throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon, that people are destined to repeat the same mistakes over and over throughout the generations of time. The circumstances may change, the locations may change, and the times may change, but somehow people who choose to do evil will always find a way, and people who desire to be indulgent and hedonistic will always find willing confederates along the way. Let's see how this is manifest as we begin the Book of Mormon. So as we start with chapter 1 of Alma, we see trouble brewing right off the bat. Verse 2 says, "And it came to pass in the first year of the reign of Alma, in the judgment seat, there was a man brought before him to be judged, a man who was large and was noted for his much strength. And he had gone about among the people, preaching to them that which he termed to be the word of God." Now that doesn't sound like much of an offense to be brought before a judge, and of course people were free to believe as they chose. And indeed, if that had been all the man was doing, he would be free to go about his way expressing his ideas and philosophies with the same freedom that Alma himself had enjoyed when he and the sons of Mosiah went about actually trying to destroy the church. But there was a difference. This man, named Nehor, had taught a very popular version of salvation which caught the ears of many people. As a result, he began to enrich himself from their support, and he became lifted up in his pride. Still, not a capital offense. But as he was going about teaching his popular doctrines to the people, he encountered a man we have met before. Even Gideon, the man who swore to kill the wicked King Noah back in Lehi Nephi. Gideon was now very old and stricken with many years, and verse 9 says, "But he stood up to Nehor and countered his preachings with the true words of God." Nehor was not able to counter his arguments, and so he became enraged. He was wroth with Gideon, and the verse says he drew his sword and began to smite him, killing Gideon on the spot. It was for this that the people brought Nehor to Alma to be judged, and we see something interesting here. It says, "And it came to pass that he stood before Alma and pleaded for himself with much boldness. But Alma said unto him, Behold, this is the first time that priestcraft has been introduced among this people. And behold, thou art not only guilty of priestcraft, but hast endeavored to enforce it by the sword. And were priestcraft to be enforced among this people, it would prove their entire destruction." Nehor was found guilty and sentenced to die. He was taken up to the top of a hill called Manti, and there, it says, he suffered an ignominious death. Now, on the face of it, it might sound as just ordinary justice meted out for the very serious crime of murder. And it was. But there was a new element in this case. Alma said to Nehor before he passed judgment on him that this was the first time priestcraft had been introduced to the people in the New World. However, it was not the first time we hear this term in the Book of Mormon, nor will it sadly be the last. Nephi had spoken strongly against priestcraft in both 1st Nephi and 2nd Nephi. In those occasions, he was speaking of the priestcrafts that would one day occur in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. In 1 Nephi 22, verse 23, Nephi defines priestcraft for us. He says, "For the time speedily shall come that all churches which are built up to get gain, and all those who are built up to get power over the flesh, and those that are built up to become popular in the eyes of the world, and those who seek the lusts of the flesh and the things of the world, and to do all manner of iniquity, yea, in fine, all those who belong to the kingdom of the devil are they who need to fear and tremble and quake. They are those who must be brought low in the dust. They are those who must be consumed as stubble, and this is according to the words of the prophet. But what caused Alma to recognize priestcraft in this case? Well, if we read the description of Nehor's preaching and the activity among the people, we get the answer. The first we hear of Nehor seems innocuous enough. It says, and he had gone about among the people, preaching to them that which he termed to be the word of God. That sounds innocent enough. All men had the freedom to believe what they would. It continues, declaring to the people that every priest and teacher ought to be popular, and they ought not to labor with their own hands, but that they ought to be supported by the people. Again, this doesn't seem so bad. It's the way almost all churches function today. Very few of them have clergy that must work for their own support. Collection plates, donations, and offerings cover their costs and provide them with a living. Some with a very, very good living. Television and radio have made popular preaching a very lucrative business for many. We accept this today, however, because it just seems that that's how it's always been. But remember, Mosiah specifically directed all his people to avoid such practices. In Mosiah 27, verse 5, he had said, Yea, and all their priests and teachers should labor with their own hands for their support. Still, though, that doesn't seem like a capital offense. Nehor could be charged with being lazy, but that seems like a far cry from priestcrafts. Well, Alma chapter 1 shows us that he taught a very popular sort of religion in which everyone was guaranteed salvation, and for this he gathered a large following that were willing to give him much money, and the result of which was, and he began to be lifted up in the pride of his heart, and to wear very costly apparel, yea, and even to establish a church after the manner of his preaching. This pride of which Alma speaks had deeper, darker ramifications. Listen to what verse 7 says. And it came to pass, as he was going to preach to those who believed on his words, he met a man who belonged to the church of God, yea, even one of their teachers, and he began to contend with him sharply, that he might lead away the people of the church. That man was Gideon. And it says, Now, because Gideon withstood him with the words of God, he was wroth with Gideon and drew his sword and began to smite him. We already read that Gideon died in this encounter, but can you see how this event devolved from a simple case of murder to priestcraft? Nehor parted way with the church of God. All right, that was allowed. He began to teach a version of the gospel in which everyone was saved and no one need fear for their salvation. Wrong, but still okay, I guess. But the effort turned into a money-making endeavor and the cause of much pride and power for Nehor. And then, in the pursuit of that power and influence and money, he was willing to kill a man to move it forward. There was the priestcraft. Remember what we read just a few minutes ago in Nephi's definition of priestcraft? Churches which are built up to get gain, and all those who are built up to get power over the flesh, and those that are built up to become popular in the eyes of the world, and those who seek the lusts of the flesh and the things of the world, and to do all manner of iniquity, yea, and find all those who belong to the kingdom of the devil. As soon as Nehor demonstrated that he was willing to kill for the sake of the money and power he was enjoying from his church, he had crossed that line. He was teaching people that by the use of force and violence and murder, you can get anything you want. Well, sadly, the death of Nehor did not and would not stop the movement he had started. Verse 16 says, Nevertheless, this did not put an end to the spreading of priestcraft throughout the land, for there were many who loved the vain things of the world, and they went forth preaching false doctrines, and this they did for the sake of riches and honor. Nevertheless, they durst not lie, if it were known, for fear of the law, for liars were punished. Therefore they pretended to preach according to their belief, and now the law could have no power on any man for his belief. But it came to pass that whosoever did not belong to the church of God began to persecute those that did belong to the church of God, and had taken upon them the name of Christ. And it says, nevertheless, there were many among them who began to be proud, and they began to contend warmly with their adversaries, even unto blows. Yea, they would smite one another with their fists. This was the beginning of what would come to be known as the Order of Nehor, and it will be the introduction of secret combinations among the Nephites. Later, in the book of Ether, we will see that it was these same secret combinations, different names, that brought down the Jaredites after 1,000 years to their complete and utter destruction. And there will be much more spoken about secret combinations throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon until the Nephites too are completely destroyed. But that's not for another 500 years, so let's continue with Alma. This contention among the people continued for 5 years and was a great trial of faith for those who stayed true to the faith and to Alma. A division had formed among the people, and there arose a faction that wanted to return to the monarchy. They followed a man named Amlici and began to call themselves Amlicites. The record says that Amlici was a very cunning man and wise to the ways of the world. It says that he belonged to the order of Nehor. By his cunning, he drew away many of the Nephites, and his movement became a real and genuine threat to the peace and stability of Zarahemla, and to the law and order that Alma was trying so desperately to preserve. Because of the structure that Mosiah had instituted before his passing, the voice of the people was now the governing power. And so, if the Amlicites gained any more strength and influence, they were going to be a serious force to be reckoned with according to the governance of the land. In chapter 2 we read, therefore, if it were possible that Amlici should gain the voice of the people, he, being a wicked man, would deprive them of their rights and privileges of the church, for it was his intent to destroy the church of God. And it came to pass that the people assembled themselves together throughout the land, every man according to his mind, whether it were for or against Amlici, in separate bodies, having much dispute and wonderful contentions one with another. And thus they did assemble themselves together to cast their voices concerning the matter, and they were laid before the judges. So this was an election, just like we're going through today. Both sides gathered their people, and both sides argued and continued and fought for their respective positions. And the disagreements were respected according to the law. The votes were cast, and it says, and it came to pass that the voice of the people came against Amlici, that he was not made king over the people. Now this did cause much joy in the hearts of those who were against him, but Amlici did stir up those who were in his favor to anger to those who were not in his favor. And it came to pass that they gathered themselves together and did consecrate Amlici to be their king. I have always maintained that the Book of Mormon was a guidebook for us today, to give us the wisdom that was sometimes lacking in the Nephite world. How often are we admonished to, quote, do not do as we have done by Book of Mormon prophets. But here, it sounds to me exactly like our political woes of today. And for the last few elections, we have seen from both sides the unwillingness to accept the results of elections, going back to Bush and Gore, and then Hillary and Trump, and then Trump and Biden. And we could be setting up for another battle this time. I'm not assigning the blame to one side or the other, but I am trying to show that human nature is eternal, and the same problems, the very same problems that confronted the Nephites 2,000 years ago are still with us today. And we would be wise to learn the lessons they learned through the shedding of blood. And sadly, this conflict was not going to end without the shedding of much blood. Heretofore, the battles and wars had been between the Nephites and the Lamanites. But here, for the first time, we're going to see a horrific battle between two groups who were both Nephites. And a fascinating new detail is introduced to the Book of Mormon in this account. But first, I want to talk about the battle, and then we'll explore the new detail. The record says, "And it came to pass that the Amlicites came upon the hill Amnihu, which was east of the river Sidon, which ran by the land of Zarahemla, and there they began to make war with the Lamanites. But Alma took the lead, and with his captains they fought back." And it says, "And they began to slay the Amlicites upon the hill east of Sidon. And the Amlicites did contend with the Nephites with great strength, insomuch that many of the Nephites did fall before the Amlicites. Nevertheless, the Lord did strengthen the hand of the Nephites, that they slew the Amlicites with great slaughter, that they began to flee before them. And it came to pass that the Nephites did pursue the Amlicites all that day, and did slay them with much slaughter, insomuch that there were slain of the Amlicites 12,532 souls, and, sadly, there were slain of the Nephites 6,562 souls." What a tragic loss for Zarahemla. Collectively, there were 19,094 souls, citizens of Zarahemla, lost because of an election. But the story was not over, and more souls were to fall before it was all done. The battle that took place had taken the Nephite army out into the wilderness to a place called the Valley of Gideon, being named after the great man whom Nehor had slain in the first place. It was there they camped after the battle, and during the night Alma sent spies to follow the Amlicites and determine their plans. What the spies discovered filled them with fear, and they returned with haste to report that the Amlicites had joined league with a great number of Lamanites in a land called Minon, which stood above Zarahemla. From there they had launched an attack upon the rather defenseless citizens of Zarahemla. Alma and his army quickly broke camp and headed back home, but on the way they encountered this greatly expanded force of Amlicites and Lamanites. The scripture says, "And it came to pass that the people of Nephi took their tents and departed out of the valley of Gideon toward their city, which was the city of Zarahemla. And as they were crossing the river Sidon, the Lamanites and the Amlicites, being as numerous almost as it were the sands of the sea, came upon them to destroy them. But the Nephites were strengthened by the hand of the Lord, and they fought mightily. Alma himself fought against Amlici and slew him with the sword. He also fought the Lamanite king and slew him." And here is where we encounter another very strange but interesting detail, of which the Book of Mormon is so full. Ultimately, the Lamanites were defeated and driven back. It says, speaking of Alma, "And thus he cleared the ground, or rather the bank, which was on the west side of the river Sidon, throwing the bodies of the Lamanites who had been slain into the waters of Sidon, that thereby his people might have room to cross and contend with the Lamanites and the Amlicites on the west side of the river Sidon. And it came to pass that when they had all crossed the river Sidon, that the Lamanites and the Amlicites began to flee before them, notwithstanding they were so numerous they could not be numbered. And they fled before the Nephites towards the wilderness, which was west and north, beyond the borders of the land. And the Nephites did pursue them, and with their might did slay them." And then here, listen to this. "Yea, they were met on every hand, and slain and driven, until they were scattered on the west and on the north, until they reached the wilderness, which was called Hermounts, which was that part of the wilderness which was infested with wild and ravenous beasts." With all the names that Joseph Smith introduced into the Book of Mormon, people who think he made it all up would have to wonder why and how he came up with a strange name like Hermounts. It is, after all, a very strange and clipped name, and not at all like the more fluid and poetic names of the Book of Mormon. It was a land of wild and ravenous beasts, and while it was not devoid of human activity, it was a very, very dangerous and dark place with many obstacles, and it was not a place of civilization, but rather a place of hunting. According to a blog website called Book of Mormon Resources, we find some interesting descriptions about this Hermounts. It was a wilderness of limited human population outside of Nephite political control. This land was northwest in the land of Zarahemla. The wildlife indigenous to Hermounts included large carnivores. Vultures were native to Hermounts, as well as other areas. The account in Alma 2 seems very strongly to be a fulfillment of the prophecy uttered by the prophet Abinadi back in Mosiah chapter 12, verse 2, that indicated that the defeated, wounded invaders would, quote, be driven by men and shall be slain, and the vultures of the air and the dogs, yea, and the wild beasts shall devour their flesh. Then in Alma 2, verse 38, we read, many died in the wilderness of their wounds and were devoured by those beasts and also vultures of the air, and their bones have been found and have been heaped upon the earth. Now, here's the interesting thing about Hermounts, and this gets a little bit involved, so bear with me here. Again, we are going to refer to Hugh Nibley because he has put a lot of information together. I'm so grateful for him. I'm sorry that he's gone. What an amazing and interesting man. Anyway, the Greek Hermonthus was a transliteration of an Upper Egyptian name around Thebes. Interesting how Thebes keeps showing up in all of Nibley's research. Remember that in Egyptian there are no vowels, so in Thebes we have the name HR-MNTS, Hermonths. This is translated as Hermonthos in Greek or Hermonths in Egyptian. In Egyptian, Hermonths is the falcon-headed warrior god, Month, whose name is often written with a falcon on a standard as a divine determination of the Egyptian month or Mendus, which is the equivalent of the Greek god Pan, who was, now get this, the god of wild places and things. The god of wild places and things, Nibley continues, in the New World, the name may be analogous to the Mexican wilderness of Tehuantepec, known as the Hill of Wild Beasts. It stretches the imagination beyond reason to consider this as being coincidental. First of all, Hermounts is an awkward name. I wouldn't even know where you would come up with that. It doesn't have the same fluidity or poetic sound of something like Abinadi, Coriantumr, Zarahemla. These are nice sounding words. They're kind of fun to say, but Hermounts? It just seems like an odd word, and to have this be cognate with the Egyptian god of wild places and things, and in the Book of Mormon to be referred to as a land of wild and ravenous beasts, is just too coincidental to me. In any event, I thought you might find that interesting. Just one other detail here, and I bring this up in some part because of the debate between the heartland theory that everything happened in the continental United States versus the Central American theory that says most of the Book of Mormon action occurred in what is today Guatemala and Mexico. I personally am very strongly a proponent of the Central American theory, and here is one reason why. Considering the climates of these two places, I think the following verse in Alma 3, verse 5 supports Guatemala and Mexico. It says, now the heads of the Lamanites were shorn, and they were naked, save it were skin which was girded about their loins, and also their armor which was girded about them, and their bows and their arrows and their stones and their slings, and so forth. To me, that indicates a warm and tropical climate. I know there's a feeling among many in the church that we shouldn't bother with Book of Mormon geography, but I disagree. The book is true, and it contains many, many clues and evidences as to its settings and locations and other events that occurred. And if we allow ourselves to explore these clues and evidences, I have every confidence that we will find great amounts of evidence to support its veracity. And indeed, we are finding troves of evidence which supports the Book of Mormon narrative, and virtually all of it is in Central America. Now, for the record, I believe that there were many migrations, both north and south, from the original land of Nephi, and we have covered some of those in previous episodes of the regular podcast, Book of Mormon Digging Deeper. While it is highly probable that many of the First Nation, or the indigenous people of North America, had additional origins besides Egypt, mainly in Eastern Asia and coming over the land bridge, it is also very highly indicated that these same tribes moved a great deal and engaged in commerce with one another, to include trips down the Mississippi River and across the Gulf of Mexico to trade with the people of Central America. This by their own records. There's a great deal of Book of Mormon influence among many of the tribes from the north, including the Hopi, the Ojibwe, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, to name just a few. I understand, absolutely, that Joseph Smith was shown and received the golden plates in a hill in upstate New York, but I don't think that was their original burial place by the hand of Moroni. However, to go any farther would be to delve into speculation, and that is something that I've tried very hard throughout all of the episodes so far to avoid. So you'll just have to bear with me and make your own decisions on some of these matters. The research is out there if you dare to check it out. Just one more point, though. Very early in the church, the original brethren taught that the events of the Book of Mormon did in fact take place in the U.S., to include New York and the Great Lakes, which seems obvious because the plates were found there. However, by the early 1840s, that opinion had changed, and many, if not most, of the early brethren of the church from that point on professed a belief that it was more likely that the Book of Mormon took place in Central America. The notion was formed that there was no value in discussing the geography of the Book of Mormon, and even the great Hugh Nibley said there was nothing to be gained by doing so. However, in recent years, so much archaeological evidence and other scholarly research has provided a steady chain of evidence to the things spoken of in the Book of Mormon, and this evidence was generated not by LDS scholars, but by researchers and scientists outside the church. In many instances, they do not know of, see, or at the very least acknowledge any connection to the Book of Mormon. It's just that the truth is coming out. Nowadays, almost no one contends with the Book of Mormon on issues of content, for almost all of it is being proved and discovered on an almost daily basis. Gone are the days when Alexander Campbell could have any sway on the subject of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon as he had back in the 1840s. By the way, just one more detail about the River Sidon. It was a very important waterway in the days of Alma, and the record says it flowed from south to north. There are two great rivers that flow from Guatemala to Mexico, from south to north. One is the River Grijalva, the other is the Usumacinta River. Both of these flow south to north from Guatemala into Mexico and empty into the Bay of Campeche, almost 1,200 miles from their source. I have flown over both these rivers many times, and I try to imagine what it must have been like 2,000 years ago when they were the methods of transport and commerce for the people of that day. This great battle between the Nephites and the combined forces of the Amlicites and the Lamanites had a terrible effect on the people of Zarahemla. While there was in fact peace during the 6th year of the reign of the judges, the battle had left its mark. It says, "But the people were afflicted, yea, greatly afflicted for the loss of their brethren, and also for the loss of their flocks and herds, and also for the loss of their fields of grain, which were trodden underfoot and destroyed by the Lamanites. And so great were their afflictions that every soul had cause to mourn, and they believed that it was the judgments of God sent upon them because of their wickedness and their abominations. Therefore they were awakened to a remembrance of their duty." Because of this, the church grew greatly, and many of the people were baptized into it. But by the 8th year of the reign of Judges, pride and the desire for riches began to take their toll once more upon the people. Verse 8 of chapter 4 says in part, the people of the church began to be lifted up in the pride of their eyes, and to set their hearts upon the riches and the vain things of the world, that they began to be scornful one towards another, and they began to persecute those that did not believe according to their own will and pleasure. And thus, in this 8th year of the reign of the judges, there began to be great contentions among the people of the church. Yea, there were envyings and strife and malice and persecutions and pride, even to exceed the pride of those who did not belong to the church of God. So great was the problem that Alma took a very drastic step. He relinquished the seat of the high judgeship to a man named Nephi, and devoted himself solely to the office of high priest. And from that time on, he set about preaching and exhorting the people to righteousness. He spent his initial time in Zarahemla, but then struck out into the lands round about. And he went first to a new city that had sprung up in the valley of Gideon, where his army had camped before the great last battle. That city was named Gideon after the man. There he recounted the story of his father Alma before King Noah and Abinadi, and how he had departed into the wilderness to the land of Mormon, where he founded a church and baptized so many people. It is interesting to me how we keep revisiting old stories again and again, and how we get additional little details each time. Yet the consistency of the record proves always to be reliable. We see that in this case with Alma, but in all cases really, the prophets have to keep going back to remind the people of their history and origins and the hard-fought lessons of the past, to keep in remembrance the blessings of God in their lives. This is exactly what our prophets do today. They continually cite our minds back in history to see the hand of God in all things. This is because, as we discussed with the fact that Nephi did not write his record until he was an old man, because only in hindsight could he more clearly see the hand of God in his own life, it takes time and reflection to see the workings of God in our own lives. We get so caught up in our daily dramas that we often lose sight of the broader picture being painted all around us. The good news for Alma was that the people of Gideon were, for the most part, living well and in faith. I think I will leave you with the words of encouragement that Alma left them. He said, "And now, my beloved brethren, I have said these things unto you that I might awaken you to a sense of your duty to God, that ye may walk blameless before him, that ye may walk after the holy order of God, after which ye have been received. And now I would that ye should be humble, and be submissive and gentle, easy to be entreated, full of patience and long-suffering, being temperate in all things, being diligent in keeping the commandments of God at all times, asking for whatsoever things ye stand in need, both spiritual and temporal, always returning thanks unto God for whatsoever things ye do receive, and see that ye have faith, hope, and charity, and then ye will always abound in good works." Well, listen, there is much more, but I think I've taken enough of your time today. I thank you for listening, and I encourage you to read on and find the great lessons therein. I'll be back next week with more of Alma. We have a long way to go with him. So until then, be well and full of faith. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.